Om Ajnanatimirandasya Jnananjanashalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha Sri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Sri Guru Sri Yuta Padakamalam Sri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Sri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Sri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Sri Vishakhanvitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya eva cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So Hare Krishna Prabhu's Mataji's. You can hear me, right, Prabhu? It's okay now? Okay.
Yes, Prabhuji.
Yeah. So we want to discuss today about, as Prabhu was requesting us, about the glories of the holy name. And many times when we speak about the glories of holy name, uh, we tend to take the external effects of what the holy names may cause, or sometimes we directly speak about how powerful the holy name is. But when we study the pages of Bhagavatam, the glories of the holy name is actually permeated throughout the entire Bhagavatam. Whether it's Bhagavatam, Chaitanya Charitamrita, and Bhagavad Gita, you will find that the you will not find so many verses. Like even if you take Bhagavad Gita, there are many verses, but not directly speaking about the glories of the holy name. And that's a fact. But Prabhupada has always told us that the essence of studying Gita, the essence of studying Bhagavatam, is that one will get the impetus to chant the holy names. And that is why whenever many devotees went to Prabhupada with different problems, whether they were from Grihastha ashram, whether they were brahmacharis, sannyasis, he gave some practical tips to them to try and mitigate the risks or the problems. But generally, you would find in many of his letters, Prabhupada would say that uh, if you chant your rounds and if you follow the four regulative principles, then eventually everything will get sorted, because the effects of the holy names are not very direct, or it is not very logical. Krishna, in many of his pastimes, he carried Govardhan Hill, right? When he was a young boy, left hand and on his pinky. If you see, it is not very logical. But Krishna is so powerful, and he has invested all his glories, his power in the holy names. And that is why, if we want to appreciate the glories of the holy names, the best way to look at it is actually from the miracles we experience in our daily lives. When we chant, we may not get maybe a car, we may not get a house, and we may not immediately get things like lust, greed away from our heart. It doesn't happen immediately, but it happens in the right doses, according to what we need and what we require in that moment. And that's why today I thought maybe we can spend a few minutes looking at one devotee who experienced the effects of chanting the holy names regularly and on a daily basis. And that is none other than, from Srimad Bhagavatam, we know the life of Swayambhuva Manu. So Swayambhuva Manu, and Bhagavatam elaborates on 4 verses very nicely, and Prabhupada writes very nice purports to this. When Swayambhuva Manu gets his daughter married off, meaning to say, Swayambhuva Manu was not a person who was using the holy names to escape from the material world. The holy names empowered him to carry out his duties in this material world very nicely. And that is depicted by this pastime when he gets his daughter married off very responsibly. And then he returns to his home. And there it is mentioned, Barhishmatim Nama Vibhur, Yam Nirvishya Samavasat, Tasyam Pravishta Bhavanam, Tapatraya Vinashanam. And there Bhagavatam writes, having entered the city of Barhishmati, in which he had previously lived, Manu entered his palace, which was filled with an atmosphere that eradicated the three miseries of material existence. It's very wonderful. Mostly when we enter our homes, uh, we may not feel that. Some people in the corporate world, they get so stressed out with their work. And when they enter their homes, they are more stressed out. And they rather stay at work and they work long hours. But Manu was not like that. Manu wanted to go home. He didn't want to escape. Why? Because his home was a temple. When he entered, Tapatraya Vinashanam. That means all the troubles he was facing outside, when he entered his house, it was completely eradicated. And what are the three things that were eradicated? Miseries caused by his mind, miseries caused by others, and miseries caused by the natural disasters. So his home was a sanctuary to eradicate the stress that he was feeling in his mind. And even those around him, in his family, in his society, they did not trouble him. Because why? He created that atmosphere. Many times we try and correct people, or we try to immediately correct our mind. But people, emotions, circumstances, and even our mind is corrected in the fertile ground of Krishna conscious atmosphere. We cannot expect that a plant will grow immediately when we plant a seed. We'll have to create the atmosphere where the plant actually grows. So Prabhupada writes in that purport to 322.32 of this verse very nicely. He says, human society is meant to create a spiritual atmosphere by spreading the spirit of Krishna consciousness. This is a very wonderful point. Prabhupada uses the word very carefully, that spreading the spirit. He doesn't say, to correct a certain situation, to set something right. He simply says is to spread the spirit. So the spirit of the Krishna conscious atmosphere, why we emphasize on the word spirit, or why Prabhupada is emphasizing on the word spirit, is because the dynamics of every time, place, and circumstance is very different for everyone. It's very different. That is why Prabhupada doesn't point, because the four corners of my home will be very different from the four corners of your home. The walls of your home, the walls of one temple is very different from the four walls of another temple. And that is why Prabhupada says that the entire Bhagavatam, the entire Bhagavad Gita is for us to capture the spirit of Krishna consciousness. And what is the spirit of Krishna consciousness? Smartavyaha satatam Vishnu. Vishmartavyo najatuchit. Sarve vidhi nishedasyur. Etayor iva kinkaraha. That means we must always remember Krishna and we must never forget him. And how do we do this? How do we spread this atmosphere in our homes, in our temples, in our community? Prabhupada gives that answer in that purport to this Smartavyaha Satatam Vishnu verse in Chaitanya Charitamrita. And it's a very famous purport. Prabhupada writes, one may have other duties to perform under the direction of the spiritual master. So we have many services. We have our material duties. We have many things. But Prabhupada writes, but he must first abide by the spiritual master's order to chant a certain number of rounds. In our Krishna consciousness movement, we have recommended that the neophyte chant at least 16 rounds. This chanting of 16 rounds is absolutely necessary if one wants to remember Krishna and not forget him. And in the last line of the purport, Prabhupada emphatically writes, of all the regulative principles, the spiritual master's order to chant at least 16 rounds is most essential. This, Prabhupada says, is the means and the ways to spread Krishna consciousness in our lives, in our mind, and in our society. And who better to make this statement than Prabhupada? Prabhupada never went anywhere to do anything but to sit down and chant the holy names. And that's how the temples came about. That's how communities were formed. That's how devotees had their problems sorted, because they heard one pure devotee hmm, chanting the holy names of the Lord consistently. And then we may wonder, but then we have other facets of services. Why only the chanting is most important? And Prabhupada never leaves anything to imagination. In 516.3 of Srimad Bhagavatam, Prabhupada writes, in our preaching work also, we deal with so much property and money and so many books bought and sold. But because these dealings all pertain to the Krishna consciousness movement, they should never consider to be material. And this statement we have all heard. We have always said that whatever we do for Krishna, it is spiritual. But Prabhupada gives us a warning. He says that one is absorbed in such thoughts of management does not mean that he is outside of Krishna consciousness, which is a fact. But then he goes on to say, if one rigidly observes the regulative principle of chanting 16 rounds of the Maha Mantra every day, his dealings with the material world for the sake of spreading the Krishna consciousness movement are not different from the spiritual cultivation of Krishna consciousness. So Prabhupada qualifies this. We may make garlands, we may do arati seva, we may sell books, we may be leaders of congregations, but Prabhupada says it is only counted as Krishna conscious activity only if the regulative principle of chanting 16 rounds of Mahamantra every day is actually done properly. If it is not, then all other activities are there simply to fan our false ego. The designations that we have left in the material world to come to spiritual life, we will carry the same baggage, we will carry the same designations. And even in a spiritual movement, those designations will be the cause of a devotee's fall down. And how does that happen? Without the chanting of the Hare Krishna Mahamantra. And one may ask, we chant every day, but I still feel that I may be attracted to designations and so many other troubles that are happening in my life is still troubling me. For this, Brahmaji in 3:15:23 gives us the answer. I will just read the translation. He says to Sanat Kumaras, his sons, he tells them, he explains, the beauty of the Vaikuntha planets and how the devotees behave in Vaikuntha. Very wonderfully he explains. And then he ends off by saying to his sons, my dear sons, I've explained all these things to you. And then he says, it is very much regrettable that unfortunate people do not discuss the description of the Vaikuntha planets, but engage in topics which are unworthy to hear and which bewilder one's intelligence. Those who give up the topics of Vaikuntha and take to the talk of the material world are thrown into the darkest region of ignorance. Here Brahmaji is unequivocally saying, for the amount that we chant, if that same amount is being spent in Prajalpa, then the effects of chanting is actually diluted. He uses the words ku kata, matiknihi. Ku kata, Prabhupada in the word for word equivalence, if you see, he translates as bad words. Very nice. We would feel that bad words mean it's a certain set of vocabulary that we use. But Brahmaji says any word that doesn't glorify Krishna is ku kata. It's a bad word. And what does it do? Matiknihi. Prabhupada translates that as killing the intelligence. An example can be given if myself and Govardhan Prabhu, we have a very cordial, very nice relationship, as he's my brother. And I know that I don't see any bad qualities in him. But if, let's say, for all the preaching work he does, someone has some inimical feelings towards Govardhan Prabhu, and they come to me and they say something about him, that vibration enters my ear through the ear holes. And that vibration will sink if I let it sink into my heart. The moment it sinks into my heart, if I contemplate on it, it goes deeper to affect my intelligence. And the moment it affects my intelligence, this is called ku kata matiknihi. And how I have seen him always as a glorious devotee, that intelligence is killed. Matiknihi. The intelligence is killed. And the next time I see him, his glories or his everything that he has done for Prabhupada's movement is completely blindsided by me. Why? Because the intelligence was killed because I selected kukata, bad words. So as much as we are very conscious of selecting what we eat, we must also be very conscious to select what we put into our minds. If we eat anything and everything, we know what will happen to our stomach. But if we hear anything and everything, then we also get what you call like a mental diarrhea. Stomach, we know we have some upset in the stomach. But the mind also has, it plays games with us. And the more we chant, but the more we engage in Prajalpa, our consciousness is always in a very hazy state. And in that hazy state, we make plans, we make decisions. On the onset, these plans and decisions may look very grand and very nice. But because they were made with a hazy consciousness, in an atmosphere that is polluted by kukata, bad words, that is not glorifying Krishna, eventually that words, that decisions will degrade into the material realm and they will deteriorate. And so what did Manu do to check all this? Second verse, 3:22-32. There it is mentioned, Emperor Swayambhuva Manu enjoyed life with his wife and subjects. Just imagine. Bhagavatam doesn't tell us he was in some Himalayas and he was chanting 16 rounds. No, the first thing he did was he was a normal person. He enjoyed his life with his wife and subjects. But how did he do it? He fulfilled his desires without being disturbed by unwanted principles contrary to the process of religion. Meaning to say, Manu enjoyed, but he never broke the four regulative principles. That is how he chose to enjoy. And more important than that, what did he do? Emperor Manu, early in the morning, every day, Anudinam, every day, he used to listen to the pastimes of the Supreme Personality of Godhead with a loving heart. Isn't that what Prabhupada has given us? Every morning, we come to lovingly chant the Mangalarti. Every morning, we are told to chant our rounds, whatever many rounds that we can chant. And this is exactly what Manu did. And this was the antiseptic that protected him from the onslaught of the material modes. And Prabhupada writes that the Vedic principles are designed in such a way. So Prabhupada's request to us to chant the 16 rounds is not by chance. It is actually by design. And how did Manu do things not contrary to the principles of religion? Because he was conscious of what he heard. He was conscious of what he spoke. And he never let anything else distract him from his duties. His wife was there. He never said that she's not my duty. That is his duty. Children, he didn't say it's not my duty. Many times I go through this as well. The moment chanting quality drops, the first blame goes to the children. But he never said that. He said that it's okay. Morning I will wake up. No one will disturb me. And I will do my duties. But he never let anything else distract his mind. Previously, we have heard of weapons of mass destruction. But nowadays, there are weapons of mass distraction. And that weapon is just in our palms, in the form of WhatsApp, in the form of social media. We chant all our 16 rounds to consolidate the mind. But when we start scrolling, then our mind becomes fractured again. And then next morning we chant, we go back to the same state we were there the previous day. And then the living entity will ask, how come I'm not progressing? How come I'm in the same state where I started yesterday? It's because for the same amount that we chant, the same amount we are getting distracted. So Swayambhuva Manu 3:22-34 tells us, Swayambhuva Manu was a saintly king. Just imagine, how can king be saintly? How can householder be saintly? We only tag saintliness to sannyasis to yogis. But Swayambhuva Manu was a Rajarishi. He was a saintly king because although absorbed in material happiness, Bhagavatam admits that he was absorbed in material happiness. But Bhagavatam says that he was not dragged to the lowest grade of life, for he always enjoyed his material happiness in a Krishna conscious atmosphere. How wonderful! There's no other scripture that can give us this kind of practicality, but also the Krishna conscious atmosphere, but Srimad Bhagavatam. So he was absorbed in material happiness, but he never let himself become degraded. And how did he do that? And this is the final verse, 3:22-35. Bhagavatam says, Ayata yama stasyasan, yama swantara yapanaha. Shrinvato, these are the four things. Shrinvato dhyayato Vishnu, kurvato bruvataha kataha. So how did he create the atmosphere? How were Trapatraya Vinashanam practiced? How did he engage in material happiness but was not degraded? Because of these four things. And in the translation, it is written, consequently, although his duration of life gradually came to an end, his long life, consisting of a Manvantara era, was not spent in vain. And here, Bhagavatam tells us what is the meaning of being productive and not spending time in vain. He was engaged in four things. His time was not spent in vain, since he was ever engaged in hearing, contemplating, writing down, and chanting the pastimes of the Lord. How wonderful. Kurvata, Prabhupada translates as writing down. So the holy names of the Lord is not only meant to be chanted, it is meant to be heard, it is especially meant to be contemplated upon. And it is meant to be written down. Bhagavatam. When we write Prabhupada's purports and translations and we try to scrutinizingly remember, that is also considered as chanting. And then he chanted with great feeling after contemplating. And Prabhupada in the purport writes, the life of Emperor Swayambhuva Manu was not tasteless as he grew older. His life remained as fresh as in the beginning because of his continued Krishna consciousness. Meaning to say, every day he chanted, every day he heard with quality. And then Prabhupada writes very nicely, he was the greatest yogi because he never wasted his time. Nowhere else we will hear the description of a yogi in this way. Yogi means we would say he must have a bun of hair, he must wear a certain cloth. But Prabhupada says he was the greatest yogi because he never wasted his time. And to qualify this, I'll just end off with one short pastime of Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur. There was once a disciple went to the Thakur and the disciple asked, he was in the mud, and he asked, Prabhupada, and this is Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati, he asked him, you tell us to chant 64 rounds, but there are many, many activities or services in the mud. How to chant 64 rounds? And Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur tells him that actually there is a lot of time. He says the time that is spent in service is less, but the time that the mind wrangles in Prajalpa is more. It's a very interesting point. It's not speaking, he says. He says speaking Prajalpa is there, but the mind wrangles in unnecessary thoughts. Kukata. He says if you can calm your mind not to think of unwanted things, then your time is free to chant the 64 rounds. And in that way, he proved how Manu lived his life. He did his duty, but he never spent a single cent, single moment, a single farthing in anything else but to scrutinizingly study Bhagavatam, and more importantly, as Prabhupada says, to chant his rounds every morning with a loving heart. And in that way, he could see the miracles that the glories of the holy names brought to his life. And how? Tapatraya Vinashanam. He was always happy because he only depended on the chanting of the holy names. So thank you very much, Prabhu's Matajis. I hope I concluded on time. I hope I didn't take too much time.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you. Thank you. Thank you.
It was very, very deep and insightful, session. It would really help us. I just want to check to our audience if they have any questions. Uh,
Hare Krishna Prabhuji.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu. Hare Krishna.
Pranam. I just have one question. It is very inspiring to hear from you about, I have not studied Bhagavatam, but it is very inspiring to hear from you about how Swayambhu Manu, as a Rajarishi, though he is absorbed in the material world, and by being in the material world, how he has really kept his consciousness all the time pure. And then I think Prabhupada has referred him as the greatest yogi because he never wasted his time. The question I have is, yeah, so it appears like it is a positive feedback as we chant properly all the 16 rounds and hear without wasting any time with pure consciousness, and then listen to maybe study the scriptures. When we do that, it gives the positive feedback and it will allow us to do more. But as you stated, when we are in this material consciousness, in Krishna consciousness in the material world, there is always a possibility to, degrade ourselves. And how come Manu has achieved such a detachment? Because when you move from one activity to another activity, definitely the previous activity will be carried forward and it will be ringing in the mind. So you think the chanting and hearing is the sublime, which has allowed Manu to, perform his duties so well in the material world. What is the secret? I just wanted to understand philosophically how it has happened.
Very nice, Prabhu. It's a very wonderful question. And I like the way you summed it up by saying, what is the secret which we are all hankering after? So one thing, Prabhu, that we have to understand for this is actually how the holy name flows into the material realm. The material, the holy name is not from the realm that we are accustomed to. That is the first secret we have to understand. Just as how Mother Ganges flows from the spiritual world, she requires a medium to actually hold her because she's too powerful. And no one can appreciate her if someone does not hold her and then distribute her in this material world. And that medium is Lord Shiva. Same way, the holy name descends from the spiritual world. And there needs to be a medium because it's so powerful. The holy name is more powerful than the Ganges. There must be someone who can receive that holy name. The holy name does not come into this world where we just take it and chant it. The holy name descends into this material world and it vibrates the tongue of a pure devotee. A person like myself endeavors to chant. But if you look at devotees like Prabhupada, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, they are not chanting. The holy name is vibrating their tongue. When such devotees chant, we hear. And when we hear, that vibration enters our ear holes and it first pierces our mind. And that's where sometimes we hum. We feel that, oh, it's a nice tune. This chanting is very peaceful. But if we leave it at that state, then we will still be in the material state. But a devotee who contemplates on that chanting, he lets it sink into his intellect. Subtle body is mind, intellect, and the false ego. So he lets it sink even further into the intellect. And when it touches the intellect, all the conclusions of the Vedic literature is known to us simply by hearing a pure devotee. And when he let it sink further and touch our soul, and when it touches the soul and we chant Krishna, that is known as the pure name. Mahaprabhu was always dancing because he was chanting this name. So the secret to this, Prabhu, is to hear from the right source. because the dose that is coming, it's like, if you go to the source of Mother Ganges, you will get a very pure state of Mother Ganga. But as you move down, materially speaking, she gets a little polluted because of the factories and whatnot. So when we go closer to the source of where this holy name is coming from, that means from the pure devotee, when we hear from them, then the dose is very strong, Prabhu. It's like when we have a disease, we go to one doctor. The moment we see he's not strong enough, we go to another doctor. And then we go for a very strong treatment. If we have terminal disease, we go for dialysis, chemo, whatnot. It's very painful, but the dose is very strong. It eradicates in no time. So same way, the secret is that we have to make time and plans to try to be associated with a pure devotee. And we have to hear attentively the Hare Krishna Mahamantra and Srimad Bhagavatam from him. And when we hear that, right, then our heart becomes cleansed, and that effect is very lasting. When we go back home, the effect is there. When it gets doused out, we go back into devotee association. The holy names cannot be chanted by our own endeavor. If not, then any name we can chant. Holy name requires association, and especially from a pure devotee. So that's the secret, Prabhu, that Prabhupada and Bhagavatam gives us. I hope that helps.
Thank you so much, Prabhuji.
Thank
It's
you.
very well explained. Thank you.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Thanks, Shanmukh Prabhuji, for asking this wonderful question. Just want to check if anyone else online has any question for Madan Mohan Prabhuji. So Prabhuji, like if no one has any question, I want to ask the question. Like you said, it's an association of pure devotees, the opportunity to hear, right? And that hearing is what you said that it's not just hearing, but it should sink in our intellect, right? So two questions. One is when we are hearing chanting of Prabhupada, right? Is it the same when we are here, from a pure devotee who is in this mortal world? This is first question. Second question, practically, how do we understand something which is sinking in our intellect?
Very nice. Thank you, Prabhu. So the first question is a very, very important question. It's very subtle, but it makes or breaks a devotee's spiritual life. In short, Prabhu, one must be connected to a pure devotee who lives in this mortal world. At some point in our life, we must be connected. Why? We don't have to even go to Bhagavatam or Bhagavad Gita. Bhaktivinoda Thakur was connected to a guru who was living. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was connected to a guru who was living. A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada was connected to a guru who was living. And those who come in his line or their line cannot say that now I will only be connected to someone in an impersonal manner. Only books I will read, but I will not associate with living persons. I will only accept Prabhupada. It works to make us peaceful. If we read Prabhupada's books, Prabhupada is an acharya. He's very powerful. When we read Prabhupada's books, we become peaceful. Material miseries are eradicated. But if we want to go further to understand love of Godhead, and if we want to improve in service, we have to understand Prabhupada through his lineage, through a person who's living. Because Shabda Brahman is transmitted through the Pran, a living force. We can hear lectures, because in Kali Yuga, we may have to make the best use out of a bad bargain. It's all important. We have to do that. But we must select some moments in our life to be touched by the life force of a pure devotee. Because that is truly how Shabda Brahman has disseminated from the time of Brahma. Lord Vishnu was living. And when Brahma first heard him, it was through the heart. But he was a living force. So same way, The answer to the first question is that we must be associated with a living person, at least for some moments in our life. And after that, if we don't get to associate because of distance and because he's continuing his pastimes in another world, that Shabda Brahman is imprinted in our lives based on our seriousness. Granatasya Swachestitam. By our endeavor, our seriousness, how much we have received. Prabhupada hardly met Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur 3-4 times. But he took the instructions so seriously. But he met physically. So that's the first point. The second point, Prabhu, to your question is how do we digest? It's a very important question. When we eat, eating is a very subtle, eating is gross, but digesting is very subtle. When we eat, we have to digest. And how do we digest? It's by performing activity. If we eat, but we simply sit, then you will find that digestion doesn't take place. We don't get nourishment, we don't move, blood doesn't circulate, and the nourishment does not get permeated throughout the body. Same way, after we hear, the devotee has to practice. My spiritual master always used to say, Bhagavatam in one hand, duster in another. And it's very literal. After we read, we have to serve. Because if we don't use the duster to serve, then we cannot digest the knowledge. We cannot digest the holy names. Then what happens is, it just stays in the mind. And when we only intellectually touch the holy names and Bhagavatam, our head grows big. Then it becomes a bit funny. We cannot handle the big head. But if we perform service in the association of devotees, then when it sings, then the heart becomes big. Devotees don't want their head to become big. They want their hearts to become big. So that's why after hearing, they perform service. And they get the experience of serving with devotees. And they learn how to behave themselves. They learn how to maneuver sometimes the tricky situations that come about in service. So like that, Prabhu, we digest through experience. And that is what Sukadev Goswami did. Yasvanu Bhavam. He assimilated Bhagavatam by experience, not by intellect. He heard from his father, but he assimilated by experience. So Bhagavatam in one hand, duster in the other hand. So that's the way we can digest Prabhu. I hope that's useful.
So the service in association of devotees is what helps us.
Yes, to digest, definitely. Yeah, because if you're not in the association of devotees, this in 4th canto, in Dhruva Maharaj's pastime, Prabhupada writes, if we are not in the association of devotee, we will not be able to discern between material duty and spiritual duty. We will think that this spiritual service is also just activities that we are taking. But in the association of devotees, we are able to find that differentiation. Yeah.
And His Holiness Mahavishnu Swami Maharaj used the example of analogy of duster. So duster, what did you say was?
Duster means, Prabhu, that you can replace it with a rag, a duster,
right.
Some physical service, some menial service has to be taken. Then it digests.
Sure. Thank you very much, Prabhu. Thank you. Really very insightful, very deep, very nice, Prabhu. Just want to check, I know we are already touching our time, but in case anyone has any question. Okay. I want to take this opportunity to thank Shubhalas Prabhu and Govardhan Prabhuji for having you with us, Prabhuji. It's really a great fortune for us. And we look forward to further associations in different forums, if you allow. Thank you very much, Prabhu.
Thank you. Madan Mohan Prabhu ki jai.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you, Prabhu. Very grateful. Hare Krishna.